The streets of Étoile-Lumière glimmered under a soft layer of frost as twilight painted the town in shades of violet and silver. Nestled at the edge of the square was Mathis Duval's chocolate shop, La Petite Douceur. To passers-by, the shop radiated warmth, its windows glowing amber and exuding the rich, intoxicating scent of cocoa. But behind the gilded doors, Mathis worked in silence. His hands a blur of precision, his heart as distant and cold as the winter night. Mathis had once believed in love, but that faith had long since dissolved, like sugar in boiling water. His chocolates were renowned for evoking passion, nostalgia, and joy, yet their creator carried none of these within himself. He worked alone, accompanied only by the rhythmic hum of his tempering machine and the quiet crackle of the fireplace. Tonight was no different, or so he thought. The recipe before him was demanding, each step a meticulous ritual. Mathis ground cacao nibs into a velvety paste, his movements mechanical. Yet, as he measured out spices and sugars, something unusual began to happen. The kitchen, typically hushed save for the sounds of his work, seemed alive. Faint murmurs echoed in the air, soft and indistinct, like voices carried on a distant wind. He paused, the pestle in his hand. "Just the wind," he muttered, though the windows were shut tight, and not a single draught stirred the air. Shaking his head, he returned to his task. But the whispers grew persistent. They were not words, at least not ones he could understand. But they carried a tone of urgency, as though urging him to listen. Mathis straightened, his chest tightening. He glanced around the room, his sharp eyes scanning for the source. The copper pots hanging above his workstation gleamed innocently. The marble countertops were bare, but for his tools and ingredients. Everything was as it should be. And yet, the whispers continued. Mathis's gaze settled on the cocoa beans laid out before him. They seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, their surfaces catching the glow of the fire. He felt a strange compulsion to touch them, as if they held a secret meant for him alone. When his fingers brushed the beans, a fleeting warmth coursed through him, startling in its intensity. "Impossible," he whispered aloud, pulling his hand back. He shook off the sensation and poured the ground cocoa into a bowl, his movements brisk and determined. It's exhaustion, nothing more. The whispers, however, were unrelenting. They followed him as he moved about the kitchen, weaving around his thoughts like tendrils of smoke. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, an otherworldly hum that set his nerves on edge. By the time the clock struck midnight, Mathis could no longer ignore them. He leaned against the counter, staring into the flickering shadows on the walls. "If you have something to say, say it," he muttered, half joking, half pleading. For a moment, the whispers ceased, leaving a silence so profound it felt oppressive. Then, just as he began to doubt his sanity, a single clear voice emerged, soft yet resolute. "Remember." Mathis's breath caught in his throat. The word echoed in his mind, pulling at memories he had buried long ago. Images of a woman with honey gold hair and a laugh like music flashed before him. Élise. The name surfaced unbidden, carrying with it a wave of longing and regret. The voice did not return, and the whispers fell silent, leaving Mathis alone with the ghost of a memory. He pressed his palms against the counter, trying to steady himself. What had just happened? Was he losing his mind? Or had the kitchen itself come alive to haunt him? He glanced at the cocoa beans again, their faint shimmer now seeming almost sinister. Something was happening in la petite douceur, something beyond his understanding. As he extinguished the fire and prepared to leave for the night, one thought lingered in his mind, unshakable and insistent. Remember. What? He did not know. But the whisper in the kitchen had stirred something deep within him. A question, a yearning. And with Valentine's Day fast approaching, Mathis had the uneasy sense that his work was only just beginning. The following morning, Mathis awoke to the pale light of dawn spilling through his bedroom window. The whisper from the night before lingered in his mind, as though it had followed him into sleep. He dismissed it as a trick of exhaustion, a side effect of too many late nights spent crafting perfection. But when he stepped into la petite douceur, the air felt different, charged. Like the moment before a summer storm, Mathis ignored the feeling and set about his morning routine. The shop would open in an hour, and Valentine's Day was fast approaching. Customers were already placing orders for intricate confections, roses sculpted from white chocolate, truffles infused with exotic liqueurs, and boxes adorned with gilded ribbons. He moved through his preparations with practiced efficiency until the chime of the shop bell interrupted his thoughts. Mathis frowned. Deliveries never arrived this early. He wiped his hands on his apron and made his way to the front. A small wooden crate sat on the counter, unmarked and sealed with wax. There was no courier in sight, no invoice or note. Only the crate, sitting there as if it had always been. Curiosity prickled at him. Mathis fetched a knife and carefully broke the wax seal. Inside was a handful of cacao beans, unlike any he had ever seen. They were a deep, iridescent black, their surfaces shimmering with hints of blue and gold, as though they had been dusted with starlight. Nestled among them was a folded piece of parchment, its edges singed as if plucked from fire. Mathis unfolded the parchment with care. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar. True love is the key to unlocking the flavor of the heart. Use this wisely. He stared at the note, unease stirring in his chest. Who had sent this? And why? The words felt heavy with meaning, their simplicity masking an enigmatic purpose. Mathis turned his attention back to the beans, reaching out to touch one. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a surge of warmth flooded his senses, accompanied by a fleeting vision. Élise's face, illuminated by candlelight, her eyes filled with laughter and something deeper, something he could never quite name. The vision vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving Mathis breathless. He drew back, his pulse racing. The whispers from the night before returned, faint and fragmented, as though urging him forward. Unlock. Remember. Love. Mathis shook his head, trying to dispel the sensation. This is madness, he muttered. But even as he said the words, he knew he couldn't ignore the beans. Their presence demanded something of him, something he wasn't ready to face. With trembling hands, he carried the crate into his kitchen. He told himself he would simply analyze the beans, study their properties, perhaps experiment with their flavor. Yet, deep down, he felt the pull of something greater, something he couldn't name. The whispers grew louder as he began to work. He roasted the beans carefully, their aroma filling the air with an intoxicating blend of earth and sweetness. The scent was unlike any cacao he had used before. Darker, richer, almost otherworldly. As he ground the beans into a smooth paste, memories began to surface, unbidden and relentless. Élise's laughter. The way she had teased him as he taught her to temper chocolate. The moment he had lost her, his pride too heavy to set aside. The whispers shifted, their tone softening, as though urging him toward a revelation. Mathis ignored them, focusing instead on the task at hand. But when he reached for his sugar jar, he found it empty, a mistake he never made. Frustrated, he turned to search for another jar, only to find a small vial of golden honey sitting on the counter. He froze. The vial hadn't been there before. Its presence unnerved him. He reached for it cautiously, his fingers brushing the cool glass. The whispers surged, their fragmented words forming a single phrase. The heart's secret ingredient. Mathis stared at the vial, its golden contents gleaming in the morning light. He didn't know how it had come to be here, but he understood its significance. The note, the whispers, the visions, they were all leading him somewhere. And though fear clung to him like a shadow, he couldn't deny the truth. Something extraordinary was happening in his kitchen. And whatever it was, Mathis knew it had only just begun. The shop's bell tinkled intermittently throughout the day, bringing with it a steady stream of customers eager for Valentine's Day confections. Yet, Mathis barely noticed. His mind remained tethered to the enigmatic cacao beans and the cryptic whispers that had overtaken his kitchen. Each time he thought to dismiss the events as tricks of exhaustion, the warmth of the memory, the fleeting vision of Élise rooted him in uncertainty. As evening descended upon Étoile-Lumière, Mathis locked the shop's doors and retreated to his kitchen, a sanctuary now tinged with mystery. The honey vial still sat where he had left it, gleaming faintly in the flickering light of the fire. Next to it, the dark cacao paste seemed to pulse with an energy that felt almost alive. It was a quiet reminder that his work was not yet done. Searching for answers, Mathis climbed the narrow staircase that led to the attic. It was a place he rarely ventured, its contents an archive of forgotten tools and family heirlooms. Dust motes danced in the air as he lit a single lantern, its warm glow casting elongated shadows across the room. Among the cluttered shelves and worn boxes, Mathis found what he was looking for. A leather-bound journal, its spine cracked with age. The journal had belonged to his grandmother, Claudine, a legendary chocolatier whose recipes had been passed down like sacred texts. He opened it carefully, the pages brittle under his touch. Near the middle of the journal, he found a page marked with a pressed flower, a faded rose whose petals crumbled at the edges. The page was titled Heart's Reunion. Mathis's breath hitched as he read the ingredients, their descriptions poetic and cryptic. Most were familiar, but one was missing. At the bottom of the page, in his grandmother's handwriting, was a single note. The final ingredient is the essence of what binds us. It cannot be written. It must be remembered. Mathis stared at the words, frustration and intrigue warring within him. The essence of what binds us. What did she mean? And why did the phrase make his heart ache with a longing he could not name? As he turned the page, a folded letter slipped from the journal's spine. He unfolded it with care, revealing a brief but poignant message in a hand that was not his grandmother's. To create this chocolate, one must open their heart. Only then will it reveal its truth. Do not fear what you have lost, for it is never truly gone. The words struck him like a blow. Mathis sank to the floor, the journal and letter resting in his lap. Memories of Élise flooded his mind once more. Her voice, her smile, the way she had challenged him to create chocolates that spoke not to the palate, but to the soul. She had believed in the magic of the craft, in its power to connect people, and he had let her go, his pride blinding him to the depth of her love. The whispers returned, soft but insistent, wrapping around him like a gentle breeze. Remember, they urged, their tone almost pleading. Mathis closed his eyes, his hands clutching the journal. In the quiet of the attic, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his regret. The years he had spent burying his emotions, pouring them into his chocolates instead of facing them. And as the memories washed over him, he began to understand. The missing ingredient wasn't something he could measure or grind. It wasn't a spice or a sweetener. It was the very thing he had denied himself for so long. Love, in all its raw and imperfect beauty. With trembling resolve, Mathis descended to the kitchen, the journal and honey vial in hand. The recipe, incomplete and enigmatic, no longer seemed daunting. He spread the ingredients before him, each one a piece of a puzzle he was finally ready to solve. As he worked, the whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence that felt like an invitation. The air in the kitchen grew warm, almost tender, so the space itself recognized his awakening. For the first time in years, Mathis felt a flicker of hope, a belief that perhaps, through his craft, he might find redemption. By the time the chocolate was tempered and poured into delicate molds, Mathis was no longer afraid. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he understood that the journey was far from over. The cacao beans, the honey, the whispers, they had brought him to this moment. Now, it was up to him to finish what had been started. And as the molds cooled, gleaming with a luster that seemed almost alive, Mathis allowed himself a single whispered promise. I will remember. The kitchen of La Petite Douceur was alive with a quiet hum, a symphony of unspoken energy as Mathis prepared to bring his grandmother's recipe to completion. The mysterious cacao, the honey infused with rose petals, and the fragments of memory that lingered like fading sunlight, all of it led to this moment. Yet, he knew the recipe was still incomplete. The final ingredient, elusive and enigmatic, evaded him, hidden behind layers of his own guarded heart. As he stood before the marble counter, Mathis felt a strange pull toward the doorway. It wasn't the faint whispers that had accompanied him for days, but something heavier, more tangible. The air shifted, and he turned just as the shop bell chimed. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, her coat dusted with snow. She stepped into the light, revealing warm hazel eyes and a calm presence that seemed to quiet the restless energy in the room. She carried a small satchel, its leather edges worn with time, and smiled gently as Mathis approached. You must be Mathis, she said, her voice soft but firm. I'm Clara. I believe I have something that belongs to you. Mathis frowned, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. To me? I don't recall. Clara opened the satchel, producing a small vial that caught the light like liquid fire. It was identical to the honey he had found earlier, but its glow was more vibrant, more alive. She placed it carefully on the counter and looked up at him, her gaze steady. This is the missing piece. Your grandmother entrusted it to me a long time ago. She told me I would know when it was needed. Mathis stared at the vial, unease and curiosity battling within him. You knew my grandmother? Clara nodded. She was a remarkable woman. She understood that chocolate was more than a craft. It was a bridge, a way to connect what was lost. She believed this recipe could do the same for you. The words struck him like a chord, resonating in the deepest corners of his heart. "Why now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why bring it to me after all this time?" Clara tilted her head, her expression both kind and enigmatic. "Because you're ready. You may not see it, but the heart knows when it's time to heal. All you have to do is trust it." Mathis turned his attention to the vial, his mind racing. The whispers he had heard, the visions of Élise, the cryptic messages, they all pointed to this moment. He didn't understand how or why, but he felt an undeniable certainty that this was no coincidence. Clara stepped closer, her voice low and deliberate. "This honey isn't just an ingredient. It's a reflection of the love you carry, the love you've hidden away. If you can open your heart, truly open it, the chocolate will reveal its truth." The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Mathis hesitated, fear creeping into the edges of his resolve. He had spent years perfecting his craft, channeling his emotions into something tangible, something safe. But this was different. This required vulnerability, a willingness to face what he had long avoided. Clara seemed to sense his hesitation. "You're not alone in this, Mathis," she said gently. "The recipe doesn't demand perfection. It only asks for honesty." With a deep breath, Mathis nodded. He uncorked the vial, the scent of roses and honey washing over him in a wave of warmth. As he poured it into the melted chocolate, the whispers returned, not as disjointed fragments, but as a single, harmonious melody. They wove through the room, wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. Mathis stirred the mixture, his movements instinctive, as if guided by an unseen hand. The chocolate took on a luminous sheen, its surface shimmering like moonlight on water. For the first time in years, Mathis felt a quiet sense of peace, a fragile, fleeting hope that perhaps the whispers were right. As the chocolate cooled in its molds, Clara stepped back, her expression unreadable. "You've done your part," she said softly. "Now, let the chocolate do its work." Before Mathis could respond, she turned and walked toward the door. The bell chimed softly as she left, the sound echoing in the stillness of the kitchen. Mathis stood alone, the finished molds before him, their mystery yet to unfold. The room felt different now, lighter, almost sacred. Whatever lay ahead, Mathis knew he had taken the first step toward something greater. And as the whispers faded into silence, he allowed himself a single thought. Perhaps the heart's secret ingredient had been there all along. Valentine's Day dawned with a quiet snowfall, the kind that blanketed Étoile-Lumière in a serene stillness. Mathis stood in his shop's kitchen, gazing at the rows of chocolates he had spent the night crafting. Each piece shimmered faintly, its surface catching the morning light, like a secret waiting to be revealed. The recipe, complete at last, had brought forth confections unlike any he had ever created. They weren't merely chocolates. They were something alive, something that seemed to hum with an energy beyond his understanding. The whispers that had guided him for days had disappeared, leaving only a profound silence in their wake. Yet in that silence, Mathis felt a sense of completion, as though the recipe had spoken its truth. The shop opened promptly at 9. By mid-morning, the streets were bustling with couples and families seeking tokens of love. Customers streamed into La Petite Douceur, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Mathis greeted them with his usual reserved smile, though his heart raced each time a box of the new chocolates was sold. It didn't take long for the first reactions to reach him. A young couple, their hands entwined, exclaimed that the chocolates tasted like the first time they had met. A rush of warmth and familiarity. An elderly woman wiped away tears, saying the flavor reminded her of a love she thought she had lost forever. Each story was different, yet all carried the same thread. The chocolates evoked something deeply personal, something almost magical. Mathis watched in awe as his creation unfolded its miracles before him. He had poured his heart into the recipe, but he hadn't anticipated its power. The whispers, the mysterious cacao, the honey, they had guided him toward something extraordinary. Yet amid the joy around him, an ache lingered in his chest. The chocolates had brought others closer to love. But what about his own? As the afternoon light began to fade, the shop's bell rang once more. Mathis looked up, his breath catching as a familiar figure stepped inside. Élise, she stood in the doorway, her coat dusted with snow, her eyes wide with something between surprise and longing. Time seemed to stretch as Mathis took her in. The same honey gold hair, the same spark in her gaze. She hadn't changed, and yet she seemed different, more grounded, as if the years apart had shaped her into someone even more radiant. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Élise stepped forward, her voice soft. "I heard about your chocolates," she said, her words trembling at the edges. "People say they're remarkable." Mathis managed a nod, though his throat felt tight. "They're special," he replied, the words inadequate to explain the journey that had led to this moment. Elise's gaze lingered on the display case before meeting his. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she admitted, "but something told me I needed to." Mathis felt the air between them shift, charged with unspoken emotions. He reached for a small box of the shimmering chocolates and placed it on the counter. "Try one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're meant to remind you of something important." She hesitated, then opened the box. Her fingers trembled slightly as she selected a piece and bit into it. For a moment, she was still, her eyes closing as the flavor unfolded. Then a tear slipped down her cheek, and she looked at Mathis with a mixture of wonder and heartbreak. It tastes like... She paused, her voice breaking. It tastes like us. Like what we had. What we lost. Mathis stepped around the counter, his heart pounding. Élise, he began, the words coming unbidden. I've spent years trying to perfect my craft, trying to forget. But these chocolates, they've shown me something I was too blind to see. Love isn't perfect. It's messy and painful and beautiful. And it's worth everything. Élise gazed at him, her eyes shining. Mathis, I never stopped. Her voice faltered, and she smiled through her tears. I never stopped hoping. The distance between them vanished as Mathis took her hands in his. The kitchen whispers, the enigmatic delivery, the forgotten recipe. They had all led to this moment, a reunion forged through the alchemy of love and memory.